You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice.
On September 10th, 1968, two female officers at the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department made history when they became the first women in the United States to be given a patrol assignment in the same fashion as their male colleagues. These officers were Sergeant Betty Blankenship and Sergeant Elizabeth Cofield Robinson. Sergeants Blankenship and Robinson are featured in our exhibit here at the National Law Enforcement Museum, and we're pleased to be focusing our 2024 Women's History Month programming on these two trailblazers. On today's special edition episode of Icons, I'm sitting down with Robin Tryon, the daughter of Sergeant Betty Blankenship, to discuss not only her mother's career in law enforcement, but also her own law enforcement career. As you'll learn, Robin and her mother Betty were the first mother-daughter legacy team to serve with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, and I think you'll really enjoy listening in on our conversation. So please enjoy this special Icons episode, following in her mother's footsteps, reflecting on Sergeant Betty Blankenship with Robin Tryon. I'm here today with Robin Tryon, who is the daughter of Sergeant Betty Blankenship, one of the two female officers who made history in September of 1968 when they became the first policewomen in the country to assume the same patrol responsibilities as their male colleagues. So welcome to Precinct 444, Robin.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to get started and just dive right into it. So tell us a little bit about Sergeant Betty Blankenship, just to get started.
You want Sergeant Betty Blankenship. She was a force to be reckoned with, actually. She was very demure. She was not loud or boisterous. She was fair. She enjoyed her work more than anybody should. She very much enjoyed being a police officer. She took great pride in the fact that she was part of the Indianapolis Police Department. As a mother, she was the same way. She was fair. You always knew if she started out, "Now, honey," something had happened. You were not going to get a lecture so much, but you were going to be told exactly what you had done or should have done. And it was a discussion, and she never raised her voice. I worked around her within the police department. I never heard her raise her voice. I never heard her raise her voice at home. But she had a way of simply looking at you, and you knew you needed to get yourself in line. And it was more her eyes. She had extremely expressive eyes, and she truly could command a room when she just simply walked in the door. She was a beautiful woman. She was not so much soft-spoken, but she wasn't ostentatious either. The room would just look at her when she walked in the room. And it wouldn't matter if it was at work or at a ERB dinner. People noticed her. And that was her reputation. She was very diligent. She was very organized. She had come from a secretarial background, so she knew how to be organized and to get things done. And she did not tolerate people around her being out of control or unkind, or and she could knock them down with a look. She didn't ever have to say anything.
which is kind of a good thing to have as a police officer and as a
Yeah.
parent, but
Yeah.
really as a police officer, it sets you up well for that type of career.
Yes, it
Uh,
does.
so you mentioned that she started with a secretarial background. How did
Yes.
that lead to working in law enforcement and becoming an officer on patrol?
She was a secretary for our chemical. She was the personal secretary to the woman who owned the company. And she had done that when my parents got divorced in 1961. She was working for our chemical, and it was downtown, and she had become acquainted with other officers. She had always admired the police officers, what they did, how they looked, the high character that she thought that police needed.
Mhm.
And in 1963 was the last time they hired any females for our department. So she was applying all through that, and she kept getting turned away. Well, she was getting close to her cutoff age, which was 32 at the time. And I don't know exactly what happened, except that Winston Churchill was our chief at the time, and he had a vision for bringing women onto the department and utilizing their skills to a bigger extent. And in that class from 1963 all the way up to 1967, that was the first class that had any females in it. And it was probably purely because of Chief Churchill. He was the one who said, no, we're going to put some women in it. In their class, they had 30 people in their class, and of the 30, four of them were women.
Okay. So this was the first time in a long time that women had been brought onto the department.
Yes. Yes.
And when they were hired into the department, was there the hope that they would go on patrol, or was it kind of intended that these women would take on the more stereotypical, at that time anyway, like in the precinct kind of roles?
I
Is that
don't know if they actually knew what the intent was or what they were going to do with these women. I think that Chief Churchill was being prodded and prodded to get women into different areas. At the time, as a female, you went into teletype, which was typing reports, or you went into juvenile aid, which was tracking down runaways or truant children from school, those kinds of things. There were no females in communications even. So the radio system was completely run by male personnel. The There were just very few areas for women to go that weren't sitting behind a desk
Yeah.
and typing reports or typing inner departments for the person they were working for and keeping that person's business organized. They used them in it wasn't really communications. They called it a PBX board back then. So those people answered the general calls coming into the police department, would direct them out. They used women police officers for that. They eventually turned that over to civilian personnel.
Mhm.
I think it was a little silly to be paying people what they were paying, even though by today's standards it wasn't very much
Yeah.
to answer a phone call. It was just not
Yeah.
cost effective.
Exactly. You go through, even just to do these kind of desk jobs back at
Right.
the station, they were still going through the same type of
They
training
went through the academy, they did
academy
all the same things. Yeah.
just to sit and answer phones.
Yeah, their academy was 14 weeks long, and they did criminal law, they did, the firing range, they did driving, I think. I'm not sure that they actually did a driving course like we had to go through, but they did something, and they did a lot of PT, and tactics and things
Mm.
like that. So these were highly trained and skilled women coming out of the academy that were sitting and running a PBX board. And I think Chief Churchill saw that. that
Mhm.
there are other people that can do this job just as effectively, and we can utilize those trained people someplace else.
Absolutely. So you talked about training a little bit, but do you remember what was your mom's training for her job as a police officer? What was that like? And what was kind of her experience there?
Well, you have to remember, I was in the 6th grade when she was doing all this,
Yeah.
so I don't remember a lot. I do know that she did very well in the firing range. She
Mhm.
enjoyed the firing range. Elizabeth was on the first women's pistol team coming out of the academy. There were 4 women on that team, and she was a wonderful shot. She could just win all kinds of awards for her handling and marksmanship. So that was another first for Elizabeth, was doing that
Mhm.
in the same time frame. So again, I go back to Chief Churchill. He had a vision. I don't know what that vision was, but he was going to put the women out there. You got to remember, it was 1967. There was a lot of things going on in this country then, and there was a lot of women's rights things
Mhm.
being protested about. There was a lot of unrest in this country, and I think Chief Churchill saw this as not only a legacy for himself, but I think he thought it was just fair to give these women a shot. They they would do one of two things. They would
Mhm.
either fail miserably or they would succeed. And he was putting his money on the side of success.
Definitely. And it definitely worked out as
Yes,
well.
it did. Yes, it did.
I know I come from the state of Indiana, which is a very uh historically conservative state.
Hmm.
So, working at the museum and seeing that the first women on patrol were from the state of Indiana and from the city of Indianapolis was kind of surprising for me.
Yeah.
It seems very, especially in the 1960s, a very progressive thing for
Yes.
um, to happen in kind of in the heartland uh,
Yes.
in the
In
Midwest.
nowhere Indianapolis, exactly. I mean,
Exactly, and even though
at the
Indianapolis is a major city,
yeah,
it's the largest city in the state of Indiana, it still feels like you drive through Indianapolis and it has some tall buildings, but it doesn't feel
it
like
doesn't feel big city.
a
Yeah.
bustling metropolis, so
Yeah.
it's kind of, it really says a lot that a chief in Indianapolis was saying like, "Hey, there's this movement, to kind of include women, and, we've got Title IX that's passed around that time,
Right.
um, let's take advantage of that and use it to our advantage," where a lot of major cities very similar to Indianapolis in kind of the more conservative Midwestern areas
Right.
not thinking that. So,
Hmm.
and he made quite a bit of a return on that investment in the women,
Oh
officers he
yes.
hired. But even then, there were still some difficulties for women in the police department at the time. One of the most outwardly noticeable differences, would be the uniforms. So tell me a little bit about the uniform that your mother wore when she started her career with the IMPD.
It's kind of comical to look at the pictures now, and having been a police officer myself, and it, I can't even imagine thinking I could go out and do the job in a wave cap, a white shirt with a Class A uniform jacket, a skirt that hit you just above the knees, hose, which were not hose like we think of hose now,
Yeah.
they were stockings. So they were wearing garter belts, and the stockings had seams down the back.
Mhm.
And in inspection, they had to have their seams straight. If a higher up would see them and the seams were crooked in the back of their hose, they would potentially get in trouble. And then the the kicker is the 2-inch pumps that they were wearing. And they weren't really, they weren't running around in stilettos, but they were 2-inch pumps.
Yeah,
And have you ever walked through your front yard in 2-inch pumps? You'd sink.
exactly.
So you can't do it. So I look at those pictures and I think, these 2 women were crazy to do this. I had Rocky boots and, long pants, and I think about them working in the wintertime. It had to be freezing cold out there.
Oh, absolutely. And just thinking about, like, having to get in and out of a car
Oh,
in,
yeah.
like, in a skirt, in
Yes.
especially the type of skirt that they're wearing, like, they're dressed like airline stewardesses, but
Yes.
they're, like
The uniform was actually tailored after the wave uniforms for the Navy,
okay,
and
that makes sense.
that's where they came from. And that's why the hat looks like
Mhm,
a navy wave cap, and they had the crossover tie
mhm,
and the white shirts. But and then to beat all, they had no gun belt.
mhm,
They weren't allowed. It wasn't that they couldn't; they weren't allowed to wear a gun belt because they couldn't put it over their Class A uniform
mhm.
jacket. If they put it under it, did not look ladylike.
Yeah.
It was bulky. Plus, they wouldn't have ever been able to get to it because those Class A's came down below your hips.
Mhm.
So then they have this purse that's 18 inches long, roughly, and 8 inches wide. They have not only their personal things you normally carry in a purse, but you have a 38 gun in there. You have at least one, maybe two pairs of handcuffs in there. You have a bottle of mace in there, which is a canister actually that you spray. You have a notebook that's leather bound and has your initials on it, which is really cool, except they have it in their purse, not in their
Yeah.
back pocket. They had miscellaneous things that they knew they would need, extra pens
Mhm.
because, you lose a pen, you can't write the
Yeah,
rundown. And they didn't want to ask a second time to have something repeated on the air for them.
absolutely.
So they had certain rules that the two of them came up with, and they weren't going to break those rules for anything. So this purse, I remember as a kid, if my mom, you never got into my mother's purse because the gun was in there.
Yeah,
But if she asked you to go get her purse, it was so heavy. You drug it across the floor to get it to
I
her.
believe it. Just
It
I
just
think
was.
about I think about how heavy my own purse gets just
Sure.
with my wallet and my keys and my phone and everything. I couldn't imagine putting everything I would need for my job
Hmm.
in that purse, and then it's so disorganized, just
Oh yeah.
the
No,
nature of throwing everything in it.
their purses were not disorganized at all.
Oh, I believe it. But you think about, like, a duty belt, the whole idea of wearing a gun belt is all of your everything you could possibly need, especially if you're in a scenario where it's a life or death situation and you have to stop the threat and grab your gun or grab your mace or something like that. It's right there, so it's ready for you to grab. I couldn't imagine having to I'm in a situation where my life could be in peril and be just like, "Hold on 1 second. I've gotta
Wait
get
a minute. We
yeah,
gotta.
wait a minute. We gotta
Exactly.
get through here."
The silliest thing was when they were at the range, and anytime they shot, like for requalification or anything
Mhm,
like that, they had this simple little belt that went around their waist with a holster on it.
mhm.
So when they were training drawing out of a holster.
Yeah.
Nowadays, if that situation were presented where you were going to have to carry that in a purse like they
Mhm.
did, you would have that purse on the range line and
Yeah.
you would be drawing that gun out of that purse because the muscle memory is not right
Yeah.
otherwise.
I'm surprised they didn't
So
make them train with the
no,
purses.
they had them wear just uh, a holster that they had there at the range and put it on a belt. And now they had holsters, but they were holsters that fit in their purses.
Yeah.
They weren't the kind they had to have them specially made to be able to hold the gun and be in there a certain way so that if they needed to get to it, I mean, they had to throw the flap of the purse back
Yeah.
and then reach in, but it was always in the same place. It
Okay.
wasn't like they had to go screaming,
Yeah, they didn't
scurrying to
just draw
get
them
it.
in, yeah.
Yeah,
It had a place.
it
But you
had a
did
place.
mention, you mentioned as you were kind of talking about, where things were in that bag, you mentioned that they made a set of rules for themselves that they
Oh,
were very
yeah.
to. Do you remember any of those rules that they kind of set for themselves?
They were when they knew they had applied to this big deal job. Now, I, as a sixth grader, had no clue what she was doing because it's I think, an older generation thing. You didn't tell your kids what was going on until it actually happened.
Oh, yeah.
So we didn't know she was even applying to the police department. No clue, because she just didn't tell us. When they got the assignment, they were on vacation for 2 weeks or a week or something like that. Both of them. They were working in juvenile. They got a notice the day before they were to come back to work to report to a roll call site, and they were going to be now on car 47. And I do remember mom and my grandmother, because we lived with my grandmother, all of us together on a farm out in Avon. I remember her being so happy that day. And they showed up to work, and that was the day they got their car, they got their assignment, they were told how it was going to go and what it was going to do. Well, when Liz and mom uh, got together and started deciding how they were going to do things, mom and Elizabeth were very similar in their their outlook on things, and their temperaments were very similar. And they got along very well. They were classmates in the academy. So they were good friends. And they made some rules. One of them was it didn't matter at all what happened to them, who did it to them, who said anything, they were not going to react. There could be no reaction. They could get inside the car, roll the windows up, and scream and yell and rant and rave and be upset and mad and everything, all they wanted to each other. But when they got out of that car, it was dignity and decorum, and they were not going to be upset about anything.
Mhm.
There was another rule. This one was my mom was not a runner. She hated the running in the academy. She was just not built for running. But
I
Elizabeth,
understand that.
yeah, me, I do too.
I'm right
But
there with her.
but Elizabeth was very athletic. She was tall and slender and very sleek in her physique. So she could run like a gazelle.
Mhm.
And my mom and her made up a rule or an agreement, whatever you want to call it, that if they had anybody that ran from them, Liz would do the running, and mom would come up behind and grab everything she threw off. Because as soon as Elizabeth would, and it wasn't just Elizabeth, there were several of the women that ended up doing these kinds of things. But she would throw the purse, she'd throw the hat, the sunglasses would go, the shoes would come off, and she would run after them. So
Understandable.
they had one in particular that mom always thought was so funny. She said it was a burglary suspect that they were looking for, and he had run from them. So mom and Elizabeth very quietly, they didn't mark out, they didn't get on the radio. They went to an alleyway. He was running supposedly in the direction that they were sitting.
Mhm.
And she said, the next thing we know, he ran right in front of our car. And she said, Liz bailed out of the car, went, everything went flying. She came up behind her. They were in an alley, so they only had 1 yard to go through. Before she got to the side yard, she had tackled the guy in the side yard, and they made the arrest. And although they were so proud of themselves, they were just acting. She said, we couldn't be high fiving and doing all that. She said,
Yeah,
oh, well, this is our job, and this is what we're
we did
supposed
our
to
job.
do.
That's
And
what
yeah,
matters.
but they were so proud of themselves that they caught that burglar.
Oh, yeah, understandable. I mean, especially
Yeah.
as women on the force and, women are still very much outnumbered in every department, but it's
Mhm.
kind of like being able to put that like all of those skills and all of the kind of adversity that you're facing and be able to put on the like even though it may bother me, I'm not gonna let anybody see that it's bothering me, and then
Right.
to put those skills to the test and it
Sure.
works is very,
Yes.
a very
Yes.
satisfying thing.
They learned
Um
a lot of things doing having the relationship they had and being able to confide, and anything that happened in the car stayed in the car between the two women. That it Mom told me a long time ago, she said the one thing that Liz and I could not have was to be looked at as little girls.
Mhm,
And the department was, because of the way they were dressed and the way they were, w- how women had been treated previously, they were very much on the hot spot all the time. They had to act like ladies, but how do you be one of the guys? You can't do that. If you're The uniform made them completely different. They
mhm,
looked different. They acted different. They would even call, if they knew that their person working that particular district was a decent person, they would call them over even if they knew how to. They I guarantee you they knew how to handle the run,
mhm,
but they would call the guy over, the male officer over, just to ask a question,
mhm.
to try to get them to see, we understand you know more than we do. They already knew the answer,
Yeah,
but they wanted to endear themselves, to say, "Hey, we're not against you. We're not trying to take your job. We need you here to help us," kind of an attitude. It was a very fine
yeah,
uh, balancing act they did between what was going on within this country and then what was going on with them right here in this city.
absolutely. And one thing that did they really experience any discrimination or pushback as women on patrol, whether it be from citizens that they were, interacting with or other people that were, their colleagues that were working on the force with them? Do you remember anything
The
specifically?
citizenry loved them. They were like rock stars. Everybody wanted to come up and talk to them. I remember Mom saying that it was really, and now this was her talking to me as an
Mhm.
adult, because
Yeah.
I was in the 6th grade when all this was really going on. But I remember her telling me that it was, to use the word cool or neat or anything like
Mhm.
that isn't how my mom talked, but that's what she meant.
Mhm.
It was so wonderful to see young girls walk up to their car and say, "I didn't know girls could be a policeman," or "I didn't know you could do this job." And then they would ask them questions about, how did you do it? Where did you come from? Are you out here? Things like that. And they were able to put that out there to where it never occurred to me that a woman, from where I was, that a woman couldn't be a policeman.
Yeah.
What's that about? I was in the 6th grade. It never occurred to me all through high school that there was any pushback. I did find out though that they endured a lot,
Mhm.
especially from their coworkers. There were many men that just figured it was the way it was going to be. The times were changing, and maybe didn't like it, but accepted it.
Mhm.
And those were the men they relied on to help them if they really truly needed help. Um, as far as questions or procedures, or,
Mhm.
I mean, I know my mom, she and Elizabeth too. They knew their general orders and their criminal law frontwards, backwards, upside down, and sideways. It's who they were. And but it can be kind of lonely out there.
Definitely.
The ones who didn't like them thought it was funny. They called them names, and without being vulgar, they called them the Pussy Patrol,
Mhm.
and they used the C word, patrol,
Mhm.
which I hate that word.
Oh, I know, I do too. Right there with you.
Oh, they referred to them that way in situations where there were supervisors around and roll call, and the supervisors wouldn't do anything about it. They just laughed. Um, there, that faction of the male officers made it all to see if they could run him off.
Mhm.
Now, my mother and Elizabeth, I have asked my mother 100 times before she died as an adult, what kinds of things did they do to you guys? She would never tell me. She would not talk about it. I had an officer, I was working
Mhm.
the South District in Indianapolis, and I had an old time officer come up to me and tell me that he was sorry. And I said, "Sorry for what?" And he said, "For what your mom and Elizabeth went through." And I'm like, "Okay, what? Tell me about that, you know?"
Yeah.
And he told me that when they were first out, they would put blown up condoms and just plaster the car. So many condoms just taped to their car that you couldn't see the car. And he said, "I got to give your mom and Elizabeth credit. They they saw it, they didn't react. They
Mhm.
went over, proceeded to take every one of them off the car, got in their car and throw them away, got in their car and left." All the time, the men were sitting there just laughing and ha-haing and what are you going to do about it and those kinds of things. So, and that was, I didn't even know that from my mother or from Elizabeth
Yeah.
because it had happened and we're moving on. It, as far as we're concerned, it didn't happen.
Mhm.
And I asked mom why she wouldn't tell me, and she said, because it demeans the women that are out there working now.
Mhm.
It happened to me, it's history, and it's not happening to me anymore. So she just didn't want to look at it
Yeah.
or remember it or but there were it wasn't it was all the time. I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't just that one day that happened. It was constant
Exactly.
things that happened to them. They would write with soap on their car so they'd have to go get it washed and drive it to the wash rack to get it washed with hateful, nasty words all over it. I mean, they did all kinds of things to these women.
Oh, yeah, and the discrimination of women in the field of law enforcement is women are more accepted in the field
Yes.
now, and especially today, where we are seeing a lot more women in law enforcement. I know that we just had a panel with the Indianapolis with some, officers from the Indianapolis
Yeah,
Police Department.
Cunningham and those ladies, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with talked with them, and now Indianapolis is, like, the first agency in the country to have, like, a majority of their of
Female command staff. Yeah.
female command staff. So it's
Yep.
very it's nice to see that even today, the Indianapolis Police Department is hitting these huge milestones for
Sure.
women in the field of law enforcement.
Sure.
And but it's something where it's doesn't go unnoticed that the first women to there were a lot of struggles and were a lot of things to overcome for those female officers even very early on.
Yes.
And those kinds of achievements don't happen without unfortunately, they don't happen without the resilience like
Yes.
what your mom and Liz had to put up with.
Right.
But then going into that, you also became a police officer with the
Yes.
Indianapolis Police Department.
My
So,
family's glutton for punishment.
you know, every family has it, and I think it's very that even though she went through all of those things and didn't talk about them necessarily at home or ever, you still saw what she was at least as a 6th grader, you don't see exactly what your parents are going through during
No.
the day by any means, but you still saw her come home from work every day, and then when you came time to choose your career, you still chose to become a law enforcement officer. So, and it sounds like you had some time where both you and your mother were on the
On
police
at the same
department
time,
together.
yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about that. What was it like working with 1, becoming a police officer yourself, and 2, working with your mom at this department?
I remember when I really realized my mom was the police.
Mhm.
She came driving up after they got their car. Usually Elizabeth had the car. She came driving up in our driveway and it was summertime. And I think because it was warm out and there was no school. But she came driving up, she hit the siren, hit the lights, and got out of that car in her uniform. And I just thought she was the most beautiful woman I ever saw. It was just amazing to me
Mm,
that that's who my mother was.
mhm,
So when I got divorced years and years, 100 years ago, I needed a job.
mhm,
And I went to work for the police department, Indianapolis Police Department, as a dispatcher. I think, 1977 or 78, they started hiring civilians as dispatchers. And in 80, I went to work for the police department. Well, my mom had recently just been transferred into communications. So she was on a different shift than I was, but sometimes if I worked overtime or she worked overtime, we would be there at the same time. And her being there didn't, she hadn't been promoted yet. She was still a patrolman, but they were supervisors, like to help the civilians. At that time, we had a dispatch area and a control area. Control just talked to the officers and ran information through the computer system. The dispatchers took the calls and dispatched the calls to the officers. So she was one of those police officers who would help if there was a question they were qualified to give an answer to us civilians. And that was when she got promoted. And that was my first working for the police department. She got promoted in the early 80s to sergeant as she took over a shift. And then because she would be my direct supervisor, she and I weren't allowed to be on the same shift. They would allow us, if I worked overtime, they would allow her to be the supervisor, but there was more than one supervisor. So if for some reason I would needed disciplining or anything like that, they would take care of it. And my mother didn't, which was actually a blessing, to be
yeah,
honest with you.
that would be scary,
Yeah.
that would be very scary.
So that was my introduction to the police department. Now, she stayed in communications. She was promoted in communications. She enjoyed communications. She enjoyed working with the civilian personnel. She knew what she needed to know to be able to give good advice and to tell people how to do their problem and to work it through and fix it. Um, and she was a really good supervisor. I'd never hated working for her because the only thing she asked me was, "Okay, now that we're both working in communications, what are you going to call me?" I said, "Well, if I'm at work, I'll call you Betty, and if I'm at home, I'll call you Mom." And she said, "Okay, that works for me." So it just wasn't, and
Yeah,
she was Betty at work, and at home, she was Mom. It just was easy, you
mhm,
know? And so then in 89, they opened up a civilian accident car. And I went to that unit because it was a lateral transfer. I didn't lose any money. And I thought, gee, I'm getting a little old here. I might want to decide if I want to get on this police department or not. And I talked to my husband at the time. I talked to my mom. My mom said, don't do it. And which I thought was odd. Now,
yeah,
she was extremely proud of me having done it.
mhm,
But going into it, she said, don't do it. Find something else. And I'm like, boy, that's a weird thing for your mother to say, who's
yeah,
been around this police department all these years, but she must know something I don't.
yeah,
She just said, don't do it. But when I made up my mind that I was going to, she was supportive and
mhm,
it was fine. She wasn't going to disown me or anything because I did. That was her advice to me. And so I spent that year as an accident car, which was also a new program.
mm,
I wasn't the first one. There was two or three people in there to begin with, but all we took were property damage accidents. We couldn't write any tickets. We couldn't do any kind of arrest. We would have to call a police car. Now, my experience doing that, they were glad to see us out there because the officers hated taking PD accidents. Um, It just is paperwork and a
Yeah.
lot of it. So we got good at it. We could knock a PD accident out real quick and everybody was happy, So they didn't give us any pushback. They enjoyed seeing us there.
Mhm.
And when I was in that job, I applied to the police department to become an officer and got hired and came on in 1990. I think it was 90 or 91. I can't remember. And went through the academy. Now, where my academy was different, mine was 26 weeks long. We didn't have, we had a lot more uh, social things we had to be considered, um, and a lot more social uh, programs that we had to know about. We had to, a lot more, the laws a lot had changed.
Mhm.
They had gotten a lot more complicated because of case law. So everything was just longer.
Yeah.
We had to drive, and that was a week. I think it was a week. It might have been 2 weeks, but I firearms was 2 weeks,
Mhm.
and I think the driving was 1 week. So, and I don't think they even did. They might have done something kind of emergency driving, so they knew where the equipment was and what the rules of the road were if you were running red lights and siren. But they didn't have any driving course that they had to maneuver
Mhm.
or skid pad that they could learn how to control a skid on ice or snow or something. We had all that. And it's just that it's that kind of thing that made it a longer academy because we had to go through all of it, which wasn't a bad thing. It was just a thing, it was part of the process. Uh, but 26 weeks was a long academy. And then when she came out, she went straight to teletype. They didn't do any ride-alongs, FTO, none of that stuff. She didn't see the inside of a police car. We did 4 rotations of 3 weeks of FTO
Mhm.
before we ever got assigned to an area where we were going to work. And then we would, so you were a rookie, 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 rookie.
Mhm.
Everywhere you went, you were the new kid on the block. So you were, having to prove yourself or make your way and there still was the guys would look at, especially the female officers in 1991 or whenever it was that we finally got out on the street. And wasn't that they didn't trust you, that wasn't that they didn't think you'd been trained properly or the mere fact that you were female. They looked at all of us as you got to show me your stuff. I
Mhm.
want to know I can trust you and that you're going to be there and that if there's a fight, you're going to be in the fight and those kinds of things. So even the male officers had to experience a lot of that. It wasn't just the females.
Mhm.
Maybe they were a little more, let's make sure here, but it wasn't anything that I felt was unreasonable.
Mhm.
You're working next to somebody, they want to know you're going to show up on the run.
Absolutely. Especially in a job like law enforcement
Yeah.
where things you're called to a scene and it can change in a second, that kind of healthy skepticism about the new
Hmm.
person that you're working with is
Right.
understandable. Yeah.
Well, and they want to make sure you're not some person that's just going to go off the walls crazy, throw your hands in the air and start screaming and yelling. And that you got to be calm. You've got to keep your wits about you and make quick decisions, but good decisions
Mhm.
for everyone concerned, not only yourself, but the people you're dealing with. So,
Definitely. And were there any kind of lessons that once your mom kind of came around to the idea of you being a police officer instead of just a civilian employee at the department, was there any advice that she gave you that was helpful during your career?
she stayed out of it. She
Interest
let me find my way because she and I were the first mother daughter legacies on our department, too.
Mhm.
There were father daughter, there were brothers, there were sons and fathers, but we were the first mother daughter. And I felt just I had a lot of I had very large shoes to fill,
Yeah.
and I think she knew that, and she wanted me to be the person she knew I was and still make my own way and reputation, and so that people weren't saying, "Well, yeah, we know you're okay because you're Betty's daughter."
Yeah.
Because that's who I was on the department. I wasn't Robin, I was Betty's daughter. Not so much with my peers because they didn't know who Betty was, but with the old timers and the command staff, I was Betty's daughter. And yeah, I wasn't offended by it. I was proud of her. So it wasn't an offensive thing. They called her Betty B, and she would sign documents, Betty B. If somebody saw that document with her signature saying Betty B on it, they knew exactly who it was.
Mhm.
Our department's large, but it's small enough that you could have known everybody on
Yeah.
the department. And there were only 100 when I was on, there was only 150 women on, and there were roughly, and I can't remember exactly, but about 11 or 1200
Oh, wow.
total. But in 1974, that big class that had like 12 or 13 women in it, they only had 143 then.
Yeah.
Now, most of those women were inside working. That was the big class that most of those women did at least a rotation out on the street in that car 47.
Mhm.
But we hadn't come up that much. Now that we had gained a few officers here and there, 100, 200, something like that. But it wasn't like the females had uh, number of females on the department had grown very much at all.
Mhm. And, as you were on the department, did you notice any changes in the roles of female officers while you were there?
Yes, you weren't a man, but you did the same job.
Mhm.
I was female. They knew it, but I wore the same uniform. I had Rocky boots and long pants, and if it was cold, I had layers underneath, and I wore the same windbreaker. My gun belt that was on my I wore a vest, which they don't make women's vests,
Yeah.
so that's a pain. Well, actually, they do, but they're really, really expensive.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't, the uniform. I still am just amazed at the uniform that my mom wore
Yeah.
when she came on the street because there were days you would get all muddy and dirty or you'd have to clear an attic and there were cobwebs and all kind. Can you imagine going up in somebody's attic in a skirt?
Not at all.
No.
Not at all.
And hose, stockings no less. That's
That
just crazy.
I've never worked in law enforcement, but,
Mhm.
working at the museum, we are surrounded by law enforcement officers all the time.
Mhm.
And hearing them talk about their experiences and running after people when they make a traffic stop and the person tries to bolt away, and things of that nature. Imagining having to do that in hose and 2-inch heels, and I couldn't imagine having to be in a situation where my life is possibly in danger and being in heels, like, that would be and
But they
that's
had to
my
look
job.
ladylike. They
You have
had
to
to
look
look
like
ladylike.
and the fact that they could do this incredibly difficult and very heroic job at
Mm.
times, is it says a lot about them because there are a
And
lot of women, even women in today's departments, where they feel like they are called to be in law enforcement, but if
mhm.
they handed them a uniform with 2-inch heels, they'd be like, "And I'm done. That's not worth it.
This is
Um,
not what I signed up for.
not what I signed up for."
Well, the
Like,
reason our ladies went into pants, and the reason was they once Mom and Liz were out on the street, they were doing the entire city, so they might get sent from one side of the town to the other.
which is
All
not no small feat in
No,
Indianapolis.
no, all the time. Well, you have to remember the interstate wasn't there, so it didn't
Oh,
go
yeah.
through the in middle. Those streets that got cut off still worked.
Mhm.
They were doing the whole city. Then they decided to put a second unit out there. So our dispatch was divided up into City East and City West. Mom and Elizabeth took City East, and they brought another pair in. Now, this was several months to a year later, and it was Jacqueline Wyckoff and Penny Davis. Penny Davis became our first captain on our department. So she was another one who was a force
Mhm.
and wonderful, wonderful woman. But they took the same car work because they were out. They only worked day shift now.
Yeah.
They weren't on rotating shifts like the men were because something bad might happen to them
Yeah.
if they were out at night.
Understood.
That we had to protect them.
Yeah.
But Penny and Jacqueline were on their car, and for whatever reason, there was a chaplain close by or on this run, and a suspect, I think it was a juvenile, ran from her.
Mhm.
And I remember her saying that we went into pants when the chaplain saw me hike my skirt over my hips and jump a fence to go after this juvenile. He told the chief it was time to put these women in pants.
Yeah.
So it was about a year or so, or maybe a little longer, but after that first year, they went into pants. And then the rule was if you worked out on the street, you were required to wear the pants.
Mhm.
If you worked inside, you could not wear the pants. You had to wear the skirt.
Interesting.
So they still were going after that. We want our women to look ladylike. And I've seen women scrap just the same, whether they were police officers or people you were dealing with on the street. They could scrap,
Oh, yeah.
and sometimes worse than the men do.
Oh, yeah.
So,
They've got nothing to lose. Some of them just have nothing to lose. But, it is yeah, it's very interesting, and in talking with, the panel that we talked to earlier this month, they've mentioned that there are even today, like, there have been some requests from female officers, who have said, like, "In our dress uniform, like, if we're going to a conference or something like that, we want to wear a skirt." And it's like, "Are you sure about that?"
well,
It
it's
makes sense.
changed.
It's
Yeah,
changed, and it's
it's
just
changed.
another sign um, of just the change in culture of femininity in
And
general.
who they are, they're
Yeah,
accepted for who they are now, where they
yeah,
weren't then.
where they weren't then.
And it's
It's
just
kind
like the
of
word,
it's different when it's kind of the officer's choice, and they're
yeah, if
saying,
it's
"I'm going to a professional setting, I'd like to
right,
wear a skirt," like other professional women wear skirts,
right.
as part of their suits,
Well, it's the
instead of
same
being told
thing.
you have to. Yeah.
It's the same thing with the word patrolman. I
Mhm,
was a patrolman.
mhm.
It isn't a designator of who I am. I'm not
Yeah,
a man. It's a title.
yeah,
It's not an adjective, it's a verb or
yeah,
a noun, I mean. And people people on the department never had a problem with that. They would call you a patrolman. You would
mhm,
sign patrolman. Um, it was the citizenry.
yeah,
They would call you patrol woman, patrol lady, policewoman, and some of that I think is from the TV show back in the 80s,
yeah,
policewoman, lady cop. I mean,
yeah,
they were trying so hard not to call you a man
yeah,
that they missed the whole point.
yeah,
I'm still a patrolman. I'm a
yeah,
female patrolman, but I'm still a patrolman. It's kind of like in the Navy, they don't call you a sea woman.
yeah,
They call you a
exactly,
seaman, when you could first go in and you're at the lowest rank. And, it used to throw me. And I got to realizing it was only the citizenry that
yeah,
didn't get it.
yeah, and which is a very kind of interesting thing to, an interesting thing to think about with, um, kind of the culture of policing and what it's like within a department and seeing all these changes happen in the department, and for the most part outside of, like, interpersonal connections
Mhm.
with other colleagues, like, in general, it's
They're-
very like, they're just officers. They're not
Yeah.
police women versus, like,
Yeah.
policemen. They're just officers, and I think we very much, across the country kind of see it that way today. It's a lot more.
I I'm talking in the neighborhoods.
Yeah,
Especially the younger women would come up and ask me, things like, "Are you are you a police lady?" It's like, yeah, kinda. I'm actually a patrolman, but
Getting back to your mom's career, how long did she serve with the department before she eventually retired?
oh my lord, she'd retired in 1999. There were things going on within our department at the time. Um, she came on in 67, April of 67. She retired in November of 99. However, there were the things that were going on within the department was we were getting ready to merge with
Mhm.
the Marion County Sheriff's Department.
Okay.
So it was done in stages. The first stage was communications, who belonged to IPD, was going to be taken over by the Marion County Sheriff's Department. So she was the sergeant. She basically ran the whole show. I mean, they would bring lieutenants in and out, but it was just kind of a placeholder until they were ready to send them to the real assignment. So she had a lot of people come through there that were only there for anywhere from a week to a couple of months. So she was running the show as a sergeant on our department.
Yeah.
When the merge happened, or when they started to do the merge and communications got taken over by the Marion County Sheriff's Department, the sheriff at the time was Jack Cotty. Well, he knew if he just let that thing go and didn't get keep the support there that was in place that knew how it ran, he was going to have a mess on his hands, and he would have. So he made a deal with my mother. You retire, I'll hire you as a civilian at lieutenant's pay, and you can be the director of communications. So then she really was running the whole
Mhm.
show. So in 1999, she took uh, Sheriff Cotty up on his offer, and she took that job. She got a car. She still had to qualify. She was kind of a special deputy in that fact. She still had her. I don't know. She still had her arrest powers. This is what I'm telling you. She never
Yeah.
told us anything. She still had her arrest powers, she still had a badge, she still had a gun, and she had her car.
Mhm.
So she might have been sworn in by the sheriff. I don't know. It might have been in his office. I could tell you, she never told us a lot of things.
Yeah.
And besides that, I was married. I was gone. I was on the department myself. So she took that job and she became the director of the communications branch for the Marion County Sheriff's Department. She died in 2002. Actually, it was March 18th of 2002 of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And she battled that for quite a few years and lost the battle. But when she was on her deathbed, literally, 'cause she'd like died the next day,
Oh, wow.
her question to me before she could not speak anymore was, "Where's my car?" And I said, "Mom, your car is at communications. It's parked in your parking place," which it was.
Mhm.
Sheriff Cotty said that car won't move. It's yours until you aren't here anymore. And he was true to his word.
Yeah.
And she said, "I have to know that car is there. Call Carolyn," which was her secretary, "and make sure my car is there." And I said, "Okay." So Carolyn came by to see her that evening and told her, "Betty, your car's there."
Your car's
So
still where it is.
your car is fine. Nobody's driving your car. So
They haven't given it
she
away yet.
No, they hadn't done anything with it. But she was in 2002, she died, and she was still as much of law
Mhm.
enforcement as she ever was the day she died.
Today, even though she's been gone now for what,
Oh,
22 years?
22 years.
Almost exactly 22 years.
Hmm.
Her story is still told here with you, obviously, but here at the National Law Enforcement Museum.
I'm
So
so thankful for that.
And we're very thankful for that too. I know for me, and I was saying this to you earlier, but for the sake of the episode, I grew up in the state of Indiana, not in Indianapolis, in Northeast
Right.
Indiana, but the culture of the state is pretty similar. Started working here when the museum first opened, and they're giving us kind of a tour of this brand new exhibit that's going to open up to the public. And the first thing I see is an Indiana State Police car. Why Indiana State? And then the Indiana State Police was one of the first agencies to employ a uniform car for all of its officers, so
Mhm.
a standardized vehicle. But then we go into the exhibit a little bit further and we're opening the drawers in the history time capsules, and we learn this story of Sergeant Betty Blankenship and Sergeant Elizabeth Colville Robinson, who were the first two women in the country to have a patrol beat, just like their male officers. And as someone who grew up in the state of Indiana, which is very historically a conservative place, it seemed like I was like, "Oh, that's really impressive that women were making these massive
Mhm.
firsts in the heartland where they're not doing that in other major cities where you would think like, why isn't New York City the first ones to have
Or
women
LA.
eligible or LA or something like that?" It's important to be able to tell their story, and for us, I know that, they're a huge part of the story that we're telling.
Mhm.
So, just to get kind of some final words in here, what does it mean to you to know that your mom was part of this huge historic moment in law enforcement history, and the fact that her story is still being told here in our nation's capital at the National Law Enforcement Museum?
I think it was significant that was those 2 women.
Mhm,
They did it right. They they made a legacy for themselves that fortunately the rest of our country has paid attention to, and it was a big deal. It may not seem big now because we don't think anything about a woman being in a uniform and in a police car, or, you know, it was so significant to what was going on in that
mhm,
time because of the women's rights movements and those kinds of things, and that it's being honored and looked at and talked about now. It's a huge legacy for both of those women, and even the ones that followed them, because they
mhm.
were all subjected to some of the same, maybe not quite as severe, but some of the same biases and pushback and things like that. So I'm as proud as I can possibly be that she's there and that anybody but me knows her name, you know?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And one final thing that we'll leave with is, as knowing your mom was a police officer and you are also a police officer, if you could say anything to young women who are considering a career in law enforcement, what would it be?
If you want to do it, do it. You don't have to be afraid. Take the advice of your elders or superiors or the guy working the district next to you. It's not a fatal thing. If you don't like it, you can always leave. But if you think that that's what you want to do it. It's the academy is fun. It's also serious, but you get a true sense of camaraderie with your classmates because you're all going through the same thing, and they're lifelong friends. It feels good. I was an FTO, and it feels good to know that possibly you helped somebody.
Mhm,
And I used to tell my rookies when I had them in the car, if you can go through your entire career and make a difference in one person's life during your career, then you've been a success.
mhm,
Because so much of what we do is adversarial, and it doesn't all turn out that way. And you may never know it, what impact you had by telling somebody something or sharing a story with them or helping them get, some emergency shelter or anything else, because it's not all just, pulling your gun and flashing your badge and things like that. It's very um rewarding work. So, young women, if you want to do it, just do it. You don't have to do it forever. If you don't like it, you found out and you tried and you learned something about it.
That's a great way to look at it, and that's a great way to look at really any career too.
Hmm. Hmm.
Always try it, and it's something that that's a really good place for us to close today. So thank you so much, Robin, for taking the time to talk with us today and share a little bit more about Sergeant Betty Blankenship's story, which you can see some artifacts from that from her time on the Indianapolis Police Department here at the National Law Enforcement Museum. And we really thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
It was my pleasure. I had a nice time.
We hope that you enjoyed this special edition of Icons. Once again, I would like to thank Robin Tryon for sitting down with me in today's episode, and I'd like to send a big thank you to both Nolly and the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department for getting us in touch. If you would like to learn more about Sergeants Betty Blankenship and Elizabeth Cofield Robinson, please be sure to visit us at the National Law Enforcement Museum. The pair are featured in our History Time Capsule exhibit here on the exhibit floor. To hear how the women of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department are continuing to achieve milestones for women in the field of law enforcement, and also carrying on the legacy of the trailblazing women that we talked about today, please check out our public program, Walking the Same Beat, the First Patrol of Women Officers, which premiered on March 22nd, 2024, and can be found at nleomf.org/museum/public-programs with another /. We thank you for listening, and we hope to see you back at the precinct very soon.
We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all of those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes exclusively on Tuesdays every month to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.